Spotlight is proudly sponsored by HEC Media.
Today on Spotlight, find out why Benjamin Franklin was impressive even as a young man before he discovered electricity. Plus, the story about Eliza Hamilton, Alexander's wife, why she always made her opinion known. And then a renowned historian humanizes George Washington by talking about the man he was. And speaking of Washington, a book about a conspiracy and a plot to assassinate him. My author said, don't write it. It's Sunday and you're watching the multiple Emmy Award-winning Spotlight.
You could call it America's first great conspiracy, but at this moment, America doesn't yet exist.
It started with a footnote Meltzer noticed almost a decade ago and just couldn't let go.
And I was like, is that real? Is that nonsense on the internet? What is it? 5 years went by, I'm still thinking of this thing. I'd find myself, just checking it out, seeing what's about. And when 5 years go by and you have an idea, it means it's time to do the idea.
But it wasn't that easy. After all, it was a secret plot that Washington eventually discovers and hangs one of the co-conspirators in front of a large crowd to send a message. But that happens just days before the biggest day in our nation's history, July 4th, 1776. Talk about getting overshadowed. Experts warned Meltzer it would be a tough book to write. He and co-author Josh Mensch's research was only that until a certain discovery.
So when we got that, I was like, okay, the whole thing kind of cracked open.
When you started on this journey, you had authors saying, this is going to be a hard one. I don't know if you want to, because a lot of it was secret.
Right, it's not something that we've really read about in anything that's modern. And I went to Pulitzer Prize-winning author Joseph Ellis, who wrote one of the great Washington biographies, and I said to him, do you know this story? What do you think? And he said, this is a story about Washington's spies. And he said, right now you can find exactly how many slaves George Washington owned. You'll never find all his spies. He said, by its nature, what you're going to be searching for, Brad, will forever be elusive. And he said, but you got to try, because if it works, you get a book out of it. If not, you have an adventure. And I love having an adventure.
At any point during that, did you say, this has been a great adventure? I don't think we got a book here. Or was there a piece of information that you're like, okay,
yeah,
now
the
we can
one,
do it?
in the beginning, I was like, I don't know if we're going to find anything, because it was something that I'd never heard about, and it was clearly so kind of buried. And the key breakthrough for me is when we found, well, one of the things that George Washington did is he started a secret committee to look at this plot. And he put John Jay in charge of it, who became the first Supreme Court justice. But at this time, he's just working for George Washington in this small committee. And they're knocking on doors, they're pulling people out of their houses in the middle of the night, they're checking suspects and interrogating them. But what they're really doing in the process is they're building America's first counterintelligence agency. And to this day, in Virginia, in Langley, at CIA headquarters, there's a room dedicated to John Jay, the founding father, they call him, of counterintelligence. And the breakthrough came when we found the transcripts of the secret committee's tribunal. And this was the key moment, right? Because George Washington doesn't write about it. He barely says a word about it. On the day that he hanged the man in front of 20,000 people, barely mentions it. If I murdered someone in front of 20,000 people, I'd be like, dear diary, had a bad day, right? George Washington plays his cards so close to the vest, barely says a word. But John Jay and the secret committee, when they tried this man, there were witnesses called, there were people brought to testify, sworn under oath, and thankfully, there was someone writing a full transcript.
It's so interesting. It's a great book in that you know what happens, obviously. We all know what happened with history, but you read it with anticipation of wondering how it all happens, right?
And there's things you just never would ever know. Like, one of the things that I loved is finding out that George Washington had his own personal bodyguards, and that he went to all of his top officers and he said, give me your 4 best men. He wanted what they call drilled men, the best of the absolute best. And one of the things he did is he personally, George Washington himself, narrowed down to about 50 men. Like, these were the inner circle, these were the ones he trusted, the best of the very best. And they were called the General's Guard, they were called the Commander's Guard, but the name that stuck, well, they called them the Lifeguards, because one of the things they watched was George Washington's life. They were literally the guards of his life. And these were the men who turned on George Washington.
The University of Missouri in Columbia was established in 1839. It was the first public university west of the Mississippi, made possible by the 1803 Louisiana Purchase, acquired during Thomas Jefferson's presidency. Jefferson's impact on the university was so profound that his original tombstone lies in the middle of the campus.
We've got some funny ideas when it comes to Benjamin Franklin.
A penny saved is a penny earned.
The Franklin we know best was wise, inventive, and old. But what about Ben Franklin, the teenager?
He seems to have been about 5'10" or 5'11" inches tall, which means that he was probably about 4 or 5 inches taller than the average at the time. And he was strong. We know he was a very keen swimmer. There are some references to the fact that he had boxed when he was a young man.
Sure, he would go on to invent things like bifocals and swim fins, and shock the world with his discoveries about electricity. But Ben Franklin was also impressive as a young man. Was he a likable person?
He had enormous presence. I think when Franklin came into the room, he was the kind of person everybody would notice. I don't think he would necessarily try to dominate the room, but you couldn't miss him. And as soon as you started to hear him talk about the things he knew about, which was a great deal, you would soon see just what a powerful intellect he had.
You see, the smart tube reaches the bottom.
Now we can all learn something about the man we think we know, thanks to a book about the young man we hardly know, young Benjamin Franklin, The Birth of Ingenuity. Do you think he had an exceptional mind and exceptional intellect, or was he just somebody who just really applied himself?
Oh, he was definitely exceptional. In fact, he becomes more exceptional the more you study him.
Ben Franklin as a child and a father before he became a founding father.
Let's get this party started with Benjamin Franklin.
What Franklin had a great knack for was that not only could he do the physical work of experimentation, he was a very good observer and also very good at designing apparatus, but he also was very, very good at logically analyzing what he saw. He had a very rigorous, very methodical brain, and so he was able to take confused results and come up with a very simple, elegant hypothesis for explaining them.
Franklin predates IQ tests.
He gives these accounts in his autobiography about some of the books he read when he was in his teens. It's not always clear exactly which books they were, so you have to ferret about a bit, as I did in the archives and in libraries, to try and determine exactly what that he was reading. And when you see what he was reading, when you identify those sorts of books, you can see they were very sophisticated indeed. For someone at 15 or 16 to be able to work his way through these books and fully understand the arguments, and then when he was in London and he was 18 or 19, actually to produce a philosophical work of his own, which he actually printed and had published, and doing all long before he was 20, that's pretty remarkable.
What do you suppose his personality was like? Was he a likable person?
He was clearly great fun to be with. He wasn't quite as eloquent, I think, as people imagined him to be. I mean, as he said himself, he wasn't very good at public speaking. He was a very good writer, and he was very good in small groups, but he didn't care for public speaking.
Well, I think a lot of us sort of think of him as contemporaneous with the other founding fathers, but he was older.
He was much older.
He was the sage.
Absolutely key point. The fact that he was 30 or in some cases 40 years older than the other great heroes of the American Revolutionary period, and much older than Washington, much older than John Adams, much older than Thomas Jefferson or Alexander Hamilton. And that meant that he really came from a different era. It's a very important thing to bear in mind that he was actually born when Queen Anne was still on the throne. And when he died in 1790, Napoleon was already 21 and Beethoven was already 21 and the French Revolution had happened. Now that's a huge span of history. The difference between the world of Queen Anne and the world of Robespierre and the French Revolution is really enormous. And Franklin was a man who had his feet in both camps, so to speak. You know, he came out of a kind of 17th century world in some ways, and yet he actually lived to see, as I say, the French Revolution, the Romanticism, all those great movements that paved the way for the 19th century. And that's a huge span of history. And not only that, but he actually understood that it was a huge span of history. He wasn't somebody who, as he got older, thought everything's going to hell in a handbasket, which many of us start to think. He actually was positive and enthusiastic about the future, which is quite hard to do, you know, as you get older, but he certainly did it.
Well, the book is Young Benjamin Franklin. It's fascinating and certainly somebody that we think we know, but maybe there's some things we don't know. We appreciate you being here, Nick Bunker. Thank you.
Thank you.
For more St. Louis stories, subscribe to the HEC YouTube channel. Connect STL from HEC Media.
What's your name, man? Alexander Hamilton.
Hamilton, an American musical, has many of us looking at the man on the $10 bill a bit differently these days. But what about the other Hamilton in the show, with a smaller role but immense influence on Alexander's life and legacy?
Elizabeth Schuyler, it's a pleasure to meet you.
His wife, Eliza Schuyler Hamilton.
We had no notion of who Eliza Hamilton really was, other than what we saw in biographies and in the musical, of course. But we were surprised to find a very spunky kind of warrior lady.
A lot of the characterizations that exist of Eliza often focuses on her as this sort of very sweet, kind of meek, very loyal, saintly wife. We have a different kind of a characterization of Eliza in My Dear Hamilton.
Their book details a formidable founding mother who grew up the daughter of a general, was fiercely committed to America's independence, helped write many of Alexander Hamilton's most influential papers during their loving, yet sometimes complicated marriage, had 8 children, and lived 97 years, rubbing elbows and making her opinion known with history's key players.
You know, there are these letters, documents of his that are written in her hand. Do you feel that she wasn't just taking note, writing down for him? Do you feel that she was intellectually stimulating? Was she questioning things? I mean, in the book, she is.
We know for sure from her own recollections as a much older lady that in recounting the story of Alexander writing George Washington's farewell address, which was a very famous political document at the time, that she told people that she knew that he wrote it because she sat beside him and watched him do it, and that he used her as a sounding board. He wanted to know her reaction to the farewell address as he was writing it. So it does seem in at least that specific instance that we have evidence that she was giving him feedback and advice and that he was taking it. And then when you put that together with finding some documents in her hand and some other pieces of evidence that seem to suggest that she was involved, present, helping to facilitate some of his political relationships, certainly serving as a hostess in political situations, that she was more than just a scribe for him. I think it's very important that it's understood that all kinds of people participated in the securing of our independence and the building of our new nation. And certainly that's the stories of the founding mothers, but it's also the stories of free African American people and enslaved people and Native Americans and people of all classes, and that it was an enterprise that was successful because so many people worked for it and supported it. And that's a legacy we all still share today. Real people need to fight for and vote and, serve the country that we all live in today.
Later on Spotlight, a school that has a blast as they teach you how to shoot a cannon safely. George Washington was a military general, political leader, and founding father of the United States.
There are things in the Constitution that we think we know the meaning of, but frankly, if you were the first person to be president, you would have wondered.
In an illuminating new biography, George Washington, The Political Rise of America's Founding Father, renowned historian and author David O. Stewart examines the period in his life when he was a soldier, then reinvents himself and goes into politics.
The whole game is about humanizing Washington. He's such a marble figure to us. And he was very human and very accessible. And this was a way I found to see him at more human scale. There's this wonderful lyric in Miranda's Hamilton musical where Jefferson and Madison sort of mournfully sing, "Wouldn't it be great to have Washington on our side?" And he captures the fact that if Washington wanted something to happen for basically our first 20 years as a nation, it happened. He was elected commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. He was elected president of the Constitutional Convention. He was elected president twice, of course, and he won them all. But he won them unanimously. And even in the 18th century, that was pretty unusual. You don't get that with box tops. Somebody knows the game.
Even later in the book, when I was reading about how he's president and they have to figure out what is a president, what does he do, how many times does he go out a week? Can you talk about that? Like, where did you find out that was a great part of it?
Well, a lot of it was done through correspondence, which we do have. Thank God they wrote letters. It was a habit he developed after his first military experience, which was to ask people for advice. You see it as he becomes a political figure. You see it when he is head of the Continental Army, and then definitely into his presidency. He wants to hear from smart people about what to do. He doesn't have false pride in his own knowledge and judgment. He was very modest about his education and intellect. And, as president, he has these two warring giants, Jefferson and Hamilton, throwing rocks at each other at every cabinet meeting. And Washington thought that was terrific because he was getting both sides of every issue. And he liked that. And he wanted to know. Now, he always made up his own mind. A lot of times he did not do what he'd been advised to do. But that consultative style, when he had the time, he always tried to apply that once he was no longer young and foolish.
HEC Media. Recognized, celebrated, honored time and again for excellence in the industry. HEC Media has been bringing home the hardware for over a decade. Arts and education to author talks, magazine shows and documentaries, individual craft achievements to overall excellence. Find all of the award-winning content at hecmedia.org.
A two-time Pulitzer Prize finalist and internationally best-selling author, historian H.W. Brands is renowned for his character-driven and surprising portraits of historical figures. His previous books include biographies of Ronald Reagan, Ulysses S. Grant, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and Douglas MacArthur. His latest book, Our First Civil War, tells the story of the American Revolution as a violent conflict between neighbors, family members, and friends forced to choose sides between the Loyalists and Patriots. For today's conversation, H.W. Brands is joined by American presidential historian Alexis Coe, author of New York Times bestseller, You Never Forget Your First, a biography of George Washington.
I had always been aware that the nastiest fighting in the American Revolutionary War took place between Americans. It was Americans against Americans. It was not Americans against the British. That was relatively civilized. But the most brutal, the nastiest fighting was between Americans and Americans. And I'd known this, but I didn't really put it together. But I thought really the Civil War model was a good one for examining certain aspects of the American Revolution. And in some ways, it was an even nastier Civil War, because at least in the case of the American Civil War of the 1860s, that war split the country on geographic lines. And so if you were in one part of the country or the other, you knew which side of the war you were on, or at least supposed to be on. But in the case of the American Revolution, it split every community, because there were those who opted for independence, the ones that called themselves patriots. And then there were the ones who maintained their loyalty to Britain, the loyalists. And this could go right down the middle of communities, go right down the middle of states. It could go right down the middle of families. One of the stories that I tell is of the rift in the Franklin family. Benjamin Franklin became a revolutionary, and William Franklin remained a loyalist. And it estranged the two, and they were never able to reconcile.
Can you go a little bit more into this idea of the elder founder and his son?
Generally, one expects the younger generation to be more the rabble-rousers, the ones who reject conventional wisdom. But in Franklin's case, Franklin became a revolutionary at the age of 70, for heaven's sakes. Revolution is a young person's game, not an old folks' game. But his son, William, wouldn't go along. Franklin was an agent of Pennsylvania and several other colonies. In London, this is when the controversy between the colonies and the British government was really heating up. And the latest sin committed by the colonists against British law and British property was the Boston Tea Party. And Franklin, being the most visible of the American agents, was hauled before the British Privy Council, made to answer for this later crime, this act of vandalism, even terrorism, as was sometimes phrased. And Franklin was made to stand before the Privy Council and the King's Solicitor General, a man named Alexander Wedderburn. He was said to be a liar, a traitor, a thief, and everything you could imagine. And Franklin realized that he was being treated this way because he was an American. He would never live up to British standards, at least in the minds of government, in the minds of the people making the decisions, because he had been born in North America. And it's an exaggeration, but not by much, to say that Franklin walked into that session in the British Privy Council. This is January 1774. He walked in an Englishman, and he walked out an American.
Visit hecmedia.org to see the full-length interviews featured in this episode, along with more author interviews about our founding fathers. History Spotlight, brought to you by HEC Media and the Missouri Historical Society.
Hello, I'm Dr. Jody Sowell, president of the Missouri Historical Society in St. Louis, and this is History Spotlight. In the male-dominated field of veterinary medicine in the 1950s, female practitioners were a rarity. Yet undeterred by this reality, German veterinarian Suzanne Saueressig forged ahead with determination to devote her life to animal welfare. Museum educator Andy Prim shares her journey and reveals how her groundbreaking efforts revolutionized animal care here in Missouri.
Missouri women have been caring for and treating animals for thousands of years, but it wasn't until 1955 that we got our first licensed, practicing female veterinarian, Dr. Suzanne Saueressig. Over her 50-year career, Dr. Saueressig treated thousands of animals and transformed the Humane Society of Missouri into one of the largest veterinary practices in the Midwest. Suzanne was born in Germany in 1925. As a child, she loved animals and dreamed of becoming a veterinarian. She later reflected on her childhood by saying, "I never dressed dolls, only dogs and cats." She enrolled in nursing classes with the intention of continuing on to veterinary medical school, but her studies were interrupted by the Second World War. Due to her nursing training, Suzanne was drafted into the German army as a medic. She was eventually captured by the Allies and spent the final year of the war as a POW. After the war, Suzanne finished her studies at Munich Veterinary College. Her parents weren't thrilled about her chosen profession because at that time, veterinary medicine was seen as unclean work, not fit for women. But nevertheless, she pressed on, and when she graduated in 1953, she was the only woman in her class. In 1955, Dr. Saueressig traveled to the United States to learn about American veterinary medicine, eventually moving to St. Louis, Missouri. There was already a significant German immigrant population here, and Dr. Saueressig actually already had relatives in the St. Louis area. Although work was scarce for female veterinarians, she was able to get a job with the Humane Society of Missouri. This made her the first licensed, practicing female veterinarian in the state. Unfortunately, the Humane Society at that time had serious challenges, like facilities that were understaffed and under-equipped, and a city that struggled with pet overpopulation. The problem was so serious that Dr. Saueressig once described her work as chipping away at an iceberg with a teaspoon. But she was determined to make a difference. Although she had planned for her time in America to be temporary, Dr. Saueressig ended up obtaining U.S. citizenship and settling in St. Louis permanently. Now, she certainly faced pushback from older male doctors at first, but her skill and dedication were undeniable. Soon enough, she was promoted to a position of leadership. In 1965, she became Chief of Staff for the Humane Society, and conditions dramatically improved under her leadership. Clinics received modern equipment such as X-ray machines, and exam rooms were kept clean and hygienic. Through her leadership, the Humane Society was built into one of the biggest veterinary practices in the Midwest, treating tens of thousands of animals per year. Dr. Saueressig once said of her work, "I sometimes think there isn't a dog in St. Louis I haven't seen." During this time, Dr. Saueressig met a fellow veterinarian, Dr. Richard Rigel. The two fell in love and were married in 1956. Both doctors were absolutely devoted to their work, so much so that for their honeymoon, they merely took an afternoon off to walk their dogs in Babler Park. Dr. Saueressig died in 2013 at the age of 88. During her lifetime, animal care in Missouri had improved dramatically. When she attended veterinary school in the 50s, women made up a very tiny percentage of the student body, but today in the United States, women account for as much as 80% of veterinary students. While she and Richard never had children of their own, they inspired and mentored several generations of young people to become veterinarians themselves. Dr. Sauersig's legacy of extraordinary care for our furry, four-legged friends is still being honored today.
Next on History Spotlight, the 80th anniversary of the St. Louis Cardinals versus the St. Louis Browns World Series.
To learn more about the Missouri Historical Society, visit mohistory.org.
This is Cannon School.
We're doing a safety school for shooting muzzle-loading cannons.
You're gonna ram, you're gonna swab.
We call ourselves artillery. We're just artillerists. That's a word, artillerists.
Deck is cleaned.
What is the appeal of shooting cannons?
Duh! It goes a big bang, and there's lots of smoke.
And it is one of the most exciting things to hear that cannon go off.
When you're reaching in your pocket to get out your earplugs and you use hearing aids, don't pull the hearing aids out. I've done that once.
They make sure you understand it. They actually give you a test on the different things that you need to know. Because it's the people who think they know what they're doing and they don't. That's when the big messes happen.
Sunday.
You have a crew, and each crew member has a specific job he must do. And it goes bang. Did I mention that?
Sunday.
I don't understand French. I mean, they go through the words in French and I'm like, just tell me what to do.
LeMay.
I told you I wasn't good at French.
We started this school in, I think it was 93, and here we are.
Trust your intuition. If it feels safe, it probably is after all this instruction.
All right, do you guys have your tinfoil? A lot of reenactors. There's reenactor groups all the way up and down the Mississippi. We have a lot of pirates. They're okay. They're not really pirates.
You didn't put the charge in, right?
No.
No. They make you run through it dry fire. Then you actually get to do the actual boom.
Search the bar. Stop the bar. Seat the charge. Ram it. Fire. Nice job.
It's just a big group of people who are enjoying time away from the world.
Hold on.
It's a part of history.
Seat the charge.
And that's, I think, is the amazing thing. It's the used to be, because it never will be again.
Next week, it's the 80th anniversary of the All-St. Louis World Series between the Cardinals and the Browns. Plus, a thought-provoking novel so good there was a bidding war from 17 different publishers. Thanks for watching Spotlight. Join us next Sunday at 9:30 a.m. on KPLR 11.